Welcome to CivilNet. My colleague, CivilNet's host and political consultant Eric Hacopian, has written 2 articles recently about Armenia's future, vision. Articles are entitled The New Armenian Patriotism, the Garrison State Military Keynesianism, a tool of security and economic development. These articles, you can find these articles under this video. We'll put the links, and these are thought-provoking and future-looking articles. I'm going to discuss the topics with Eric. Eric, thank you for joining us.
It's a pleasure.
You're idealistic, and you're sort of juxtaposing idealism with the realism on the ground. How can we achieve the goals that you put in your articles, that you bring forward with the realities on the ground?
Well, thank you for having me, by the way. My first thing is we have to be, some of these ideas are radical, you can say, but you have to be as radical as reality itself. And I think we're in a position where we have to question every primary idea that we've had for many years. It doesn't mean that all of our ideas were bad ones, but they need to be grounded in reality. And we need to focus on work on making, shaping reality in our face, in our direction. And in some ways, imposing our will on our problems. So what I'm really talking about is having a realistic view of where we're at, while at the same time having a goal and a vision of how you accomplish it. And so much of this comes down to things that we haven't done in 30 years, which is 1, state building, economy building, and thinking in clear terms, who we are and where we want to go. I think the one thing that's consistent in this war proved to us that in the last 30 years, both Armenia and the diaspora has not thought out clearly what it means to be a country, how it means to be responsible for yourself, both in defense and foreign policy and economy, and having not a unified vision. I don't believe in unified visions. It's a very totalitarian concept, but having a vision of where you want to go. So I think at the same time that we're in a difficult situation, if you look at where we're at as a country compared to other countries and other peoples, almost everything that is wrong here can actually be fixed by everything that is right here, if we are focused on what needs to be done and have a clear vision of where we want to go.
One thing that you mentioned here is the army, that we need a new military, we need a new army, a professional army that will defend both Armenia and Artsakh, and you stress that Armenia should focus on its national security, and national security would be the first, second, and third priority of the country, and the army that would be that much competent to fight any enemy. And Eric, I just wrote down the numbers of our neighbors, how much they spent on their military. For example, Turkey spends more than $20 billion, and it has the second largest army in NATO. Azerbaijan spends 5 times more than Armenia, around $3 billion, and we just spent $500 million, and it's around 5% of our GDP. My question is, whatever we do, even if we quadruple our spending on the defense, even if we quadruple our budget and GDP, etc., there is still this overwhelming force that we cannot counter alone. I'm thinking, like many other countries, for example, Germany, Japan, and other countries who sort of outsource their defense to NATO, to the US, etc. What about this sort of thinking? Of course, I'm not excluding, I'm not ruling out that we really do need a strong professional army. But what about outsourcing?
Well, I think, first of all, when it comes to Turkey, you have to look at a larger profile. And there's security that I think we need to be responsible for, and there's what I call ultimate security. Ultimate security is against the Turkish state, which can only come through Russia. As a state, Armenia cannot defend itself against any kind of a Turkish threat. That's just not realistic. So this is where defense networks with Russia come in. So obviously you have to be realistic in that context. But as far as Azerbaijan is concerned, we can certainly come up with a military that is far better, far more professional, and be able to take on any threats from them, especially to the physical security of people in Artsakh. I think the way to look at this thing is the garrison state is really reverse engineering state building. The state building that we have not done. You want to start from the military sector. One, because the military, just the way it's structured, it's easier to reform. Because unlike a state bureaucracy, it's very hierarchical. You can actually make dramatic changes on top and force your way down. So I think what we're doing is reforming the military and creating this garrison state is actually the first step in the reform of the country. If you want to reform the country, you reform the military. And the military reform from there leads directly into economic reform and other reforms in other areas, because it becomes an example of how you approach things. So I think that's what you're looking at. Secondly, as far as military spending and efficiency goes, those numbers are never reflective of a capability of the military. To put things in perspective, I think the Saudis spend far more than the Israelis do on their defense. And they buy some of the most advanced weapon systems in the world that for the most part they can't use. Which is a more powerful country, Saudi Arabia or Israel? So military spending in and of itself does not tell the whole story. And as both of us, as many of us learn from the war, we know that there were very basic things that had nothing to do with military spending that we could have done that would have had better results and better outcomes, whether it was communication, morale, logistics, that don't involve tremendous amounts of money. So you can actually reform the military to a great extent without having the most modern weapons. Obviously that accentuates it and is important to have that, and you eventually need to have that, hopefully made by yourself, at least a greater part of it. But that military spending in and of itself does not determine security. And many people want to forget this, but even up to the summer of this year, we all remember the July clashes in Tavush. What was the general impression there? The general impression was that the Azeris have spent tons of money and their army was utterly humiliated in Tavush. Maybe that perception was not correct, but that was the public perception. In fact, it was the public perception in Baku. And as we all know, at that point, Aliyev took his military command and gave it to the Turks. They were far more competent than him, and it ended up in getting the results that we did. So I think, first and foremost, the garrison state is a development tool, and we need to look at it that way. And again, as I said, reverse engineering state building. Instead of building the state, first you build a military that allows you to build the state. And secondly, the spending is not the only determinant of having an effective military force.
Eric, you say that we don't need a state that has an army, but rather we need an army that has a state. This is a sort of, to my understanding, militaristic rhetoric, and isn't it excluding the possibility for peace, the possibility for looking towards peace initiatives, opportunities, etc.?
Well, first of all, I think your concerns are very well thought out, because this kind of a state is quite dangerous. It's more often than not dangerous to its own citizens. As I said in what I wrote, there's two corollaries with this. Any kind of a reform like this has to have two corollaries. One is that the military state that you're building has to always be subservient to the democratic elected officials and to democratic governance. And secondly, it should not be a drain on the national economy. As I said, it needs to be something that kickstarts our national economy and industry and industrialization and research and other things. This kind of approach does not exclude in any way a possible peace, because as we know, as uncomfortable or as unfavorable the current environment is in Artsakh, politically it's not impossible for this cold, unhappy peace to hold for the next 20, 30, 50 years. I mean, history has plenty of examples of it. So absolutely not. We should look at all options in all ways, because as I've said before, the best day, the worst day in peace is better than the best day in war. That should always be our option, and it should always be our goal. However, given who our neighbors are, given the experiences that we went through, there's absolutely no excuse for us not to be ready for any eventualities. Because ultimately, you have to look at the neighborhood that we live in. We have 4 neighbors, 2 of whom are, for the most part, not problematic. To the east of us, we have a failed state with money. That in 20 years is going to be a failed state without money.
We lost the war to that failed state.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And that's an indictment of us. We lost the war to a failed state with money. Any country like that is ultimately problematic in the issues that it caused for its neighbors. To the west of us, what do we have? We have the last unreformed fascist state in Europe. And that's the reality. People try to come up with different names for it, but no one worships Mussolini anymore in Italy. No one worships Hitler in Germany or Franco in Spain. But Ataturk, who was set up a neo-fascist state, is still worshipped as some kind of a god figure, and that's by the reformists. So in this kind of a neighborhood, you have to have security as your 1, 2nd, and 3rd priorities, even if that security means having Garrison State plus very strong military alliances with much larger powers than yourselves, like Russia.
Rick, you're speaking about diaspora too, and you suggest that an Armenian volunteer legion should be established, that thousands of ethnic Armenians that have served in the Russian, Syrian, French, and other militaries can come and share their experience here in Armenia. And I have various perceptions about this. The first one is of course, we need more diasporan involvement, more diasporan investment here in Armenia. It's not only about the money, like we have many centers of excellence in Armenia that are diasporan investments, like for example, TUMO Center of Creative Technologies, American University of Armenia. This very institution is a diasporan investment. On the other hand, we cannot expect that much diasporan involvement, especially when it comes to war. For example, in this recent war, we didn't have that many diasporans coming to Armenia to fight, although there were volunteers and some people, but we could see these big rallies throughout the world. How can we tap the best potential of diaspora without having illusions, without harboring redundant illusions?
Well, and as you know, I'm very critical of our state here, but I'm equally as critical of the diaspora in general.
And I'm sorry, you are a diasporan person, you are a diasporan man who have settled in Armenia and whose kids attend an local Armenian school. So you are not that typical classical diasporan.
No, it's, let's take it for what I am. The diaspora institutions have failed Armenia. This is not a negative on many people that have done wonderful things. That's not that issue. There's a lot of individuals, but as a collective, what Armenian diaspora has not been involved in is in state building. The fact that up to now we have not set up a single think tank worthy of anything that has experts on the politics of the region. And that's a knock on the diaspora that can be easily done. Diaspora institutions never adjusted to an independent Armenia.
Because they have community things.
They never thought in those terms. They never thought in state building terms, or what it means to build a state. And you can see that. And if you look at, even internally, I think people who run this notion, we all saw this during the war, and we heard it. You know, everybody thought the Russians were going to get involved, and the war ends in 4 days. Then the war ends in 10 days. Well, that's not how the world works. You need to be responsible for your own defense. You need to be responsible for your own decisions and not count on other people. This is not, we're not a Soviet republic. We're an independent country. So what happens to us is what happens to us. And we're responsible for it, no matter how unfair it might be. So we've never adjusted to that. I think as far as the specifics of the volunteer corps, there's tremendous Armenian expertise in different militaries. From all kinds of different, there's very high-ranking, I think the head of the U.S. Air Force in Europe is an Armenian American. Obviously, there's very high-ranking Armenians in the Russian military. We know, for example, there were 300 or 400 Armenians that have fought in the Syrian Arab Army, which is the government army, for 10 years in urban warfare. Could you imagine what their experience would have been worth in Artsakh? So I think this is more of a symbolic thing at the beginning. I don't expect 10,000 people to show up, but if you have an organized place for people to go, there will be people who will come. There will be retired military people who are willing to come and help. Because if you look at just the images of our soldiers, as heroic as they were, as much as we loved them, look at the way they dressed and look at how the opponents dressed. Ours looked like a 20th century army, theirs looked like a 21st century army. Basic communication, basic gear. So there's a lot that can be improved by learning from people that have experiences from far more powerful armies. Again, I think this is more symbolic in the short run, but the symmetry of people working together cannot be anything but good as far as what you learn and how you upgrade your techniques and your fighting capabilities.
Eric, if we look at the history, there are lots of examples when a defeated nation could eventually become victorious. Like, take the example of Germany, Sweden, Japan, many others. How do we catalyze this failure for good? What kind of lessons we should learn, and what would be the way to achieve that?
Well, you're 100% right, and as I think I've said this before, history operates dialectically. Out of good things come bad things. Out of good things, out of bad things come good things. So, what does this tell us? What this war told us is where we're at in the world. That's essentially what it was. Even though the war itself can really be described as a black swan event that couldn't have happened 6 months before or 6 months after, this war could not be started very likely right now. If the war hadn't happened on September 27th, it probably wouldn't have happened. And if the war hadn't happened, we would not have known the scale of our state failures, or our military failures, or our lack of ability in the last 30 years to build a functional state. Because we would have thought, well, the military is not bad. Look at what happened in Tavushin. We wouldn't have learned any of these things. This harsh moment, which is horrendous. I think that there's a layer of sadness on the society that's permanent. You see it, you feel it. Can only be one thing. It can be a catalyst to fundamentally reform the country and to take state building seriously. I think there's one thing that can unite everyone in the society, no matter what side they're on. They're on the current government side, the opposition side, on neither side. And that is, what happened in those 44 days can never be allowed to happen again, under any scenario, ever. So if we unify around that, the only way to not have those 44 days ever happen again is to build a functional economy, a functional state, and a functional military. And we need to dedicate ourselves to that, no matter who we are, where we come from. And that's when I say when our notion of patriotism has to be much broader than that. I have a health clinic in Paris, and I open one up in Goris. That's an act of patriotism. It's not necessarily picking up a gun and fighting. To build the state, to build the country, and to build the military are the ultimate levels of patriotism. And I think we need to take this terrible moment and wake up about where we stand in the world and how we can build a functional state. And that's really the key. The key starts with building a functional state that has competence. That word is key, competence. What we learn is we have a state that has no competence on the foreign policy level, on the military level. We need to build state competence. That should be our goal.
Is that a bottom-up process, or it's more up-down process? Because you will need, definitely will need a more political will to conduct reforms itself.
Both, but one should not be an excuse for the other. The political class in Armenia is a failure on all sides. Let's be honest about it. You know, people spend all their days, is it Nikol's fault? Is it Kocharyan's? It's all their faults. Nikol's fault was that he did not know that after 2 years of running the country that his army was inept and could not win a war. Well, if your army is inept and cannot win a war, you have a different approach to foreign policy. You don't do the things that he did. At the same time, the world wasn't built in 2 years. The dysfunction in this country go back 30 years. The fact that you have a military brass that is not interested in any modern technology or keeping up with things or thinking that drones are going to be important, or you have the previous regimes that through corruption gutted the country. This is a total systematic failure. We should not, this person, that person, yeah, you can blame all of them for a lot of individual things. But you know, all of these people did not come out of another country. They came out of our culture, okay? If you hate Nikol, he's still an Armenian. If you hate Kocharyan, he's still an Armenian. They came out of somewhere. And if they're dysfunctional, it's because certain parts of our country or our culture are dysfunctional. So we need to look at it as a whole. And yes, we need better leaders, but we also need better citizens, and we need a better diaspora. So you start where you can. You know, you hold up your end of the sky, and then over time, and I'm actually quite confident in the current young generation of people that we have. I think part of our problem is we need to hold on for 10 or 15 years in this, what I call the competent class, or the competent age group of Armenians, which for the most part is, you know, the 20 to 30-year-olds, are old enough to take over the country. So it's not either or. You know, we need to be bottom up, and at the same time, you need better leadership. But you cannot wait. One does not need to wait for the other.
Thank you, Eric. And again, I want to remind our viewers that they can find Eric's articles under this video. Thank you for being with CivilNet.